Hello, I've been invited to speak to you today on the topic of what Tolkien can teach us about the importance of using the imagination in our Catholic faith. So first, what is the imagination? Everyone has an imagination because it's a basic human faculty. It's what Tolkien calls the mental power of image making. In fact, the imagination is a fundamental human faculty. It's a necessary part of human thought, human cognition. Our senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell bring us data about the world around us. But how do we make sense of that data? How do we draw conclusions about it? The function of the imagination is to take that sensory data and shape it into meaningful images and then give it to the reason, the intellect, to think about. So the senses provide the data. The imagination then makes meaning from that data. In order for our reason to make judgments about truth and falsehood, it has to have something meaningful to work on. And that's what C.S. Lewis means when he says that reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. So that's the imagination. But why is it important to engage the imagination with regard to our faith? And I want to look at that from the angle of how Tolkien used his creative imagination in line with his Catholic faith. And that will bring us to considering Tolkien's engagement with modern culture. Tolkien was a man of the 20th century. Now, that's not to say that he uncritically embraced modernity and all that came of it. Far from it. The Lord of the Rings is a profound critique of many aspects of the modern world, such as totalitarianism and the abuse of power. But he's able to make this critique. He's able to present a compelling alternate vision precisely because he understands the culture that he's in. He lived in the modern world, he engaged with it, and one of the ways that he did so was through reading the literature of his modern day and assimilating what he read into his own creative Christian imagination. Well, what is the Christian imagination? How do we characterize it? For one thing, a Christian imagination finds all parts of the human experience to be meaningful, from conception to death, including the body as well as the soul, involving both the individual person and the community. A Christian imagination also recognizes that even when people are alienated from God, disbelieving in him, they still have access to some truths about him, just by virtue of being human and living in the world that God has made. The Christian imagination is capacious, indeed cosmic in its reach, and it is incarnational and sacramental in its expression. And that is precisely what we see expressed in the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien himself said that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. So The Lord of the Rings is the fruit of its author's Catholic imagination, but not in a simplistic or obvious way. Certainly its popularity shows that. The Lord of the Rings is exceptionally popular across generations and with a global audience. Tolkien's work has been translated into several dozen languages. And it finds enthusiastic readers of every religious faith and of no religious faith at all. So it's a very interesting question to ask, what fed Tolkien's creative imagination? What provided the materials that he was able to use so skillfully to create his own deeply meaningful stories? Tolkien said of The Lord of the Rings that such a story grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. Out of all that has been seen or thought or read. Now for Tolkien, that covers a great deal of material. His life experiences, his friendships, his academic work, his reading. His great friend C.S. Lewis once commented that Tolkien is the most unmanageable man in conversation that I've ever met. He will talk to you all right, but the subject of his remarks will be whatever happens to be interesting to him at the moment, which might be anything from Middle English words to Oxford politics. And his conversation ranged both widely and deeply. Clyde Kilby, who spent a summer attempting to assist him with assembling the Silmarillion, recalled that there was not a single visit that I made to Tolkien's home in which the conversation did not at some point fall easily into a discussion of religion, or rather Christianity. And that brings us to the key point, his Christian faith. Considering Tolkien's faith matters a great deal if we wish to have a deeper understanding of his creative output. Tolkien himself explained that there is a scale of significance in the types of facts that are relevant to understanding a writer's work. In his own case, these facts include, at the bottom of the scale, his preference for certain languages over others. Other facts, he says, however dryly expressed, are really significant, such as his rural childhood before the age of the machine. Then he goes on to say, more important, I am a Christian. We know that his linguistic interests and his early life in a Worcestershire village were indeed imaginatively formative. To know one influences, not to deny another. But by Tolkien's own reckoning, his faith was more important for understanding his writings than either of these. Now, The Lord of the Rings is not a religious allegory, but that's not to say it's unconnected to the Christian religion that Tolkien actually believed in. In fact, he get a little testy when interviewers miss this point. Of course, God is in The Lord of the Rings. The period was pre-Christian, but it was a monotheistic world. That's a remark he made in an interview. And then the interviewer asked, monotheistic? Then who was the one God of Middle-earth? And Tolkien said, the one, of course. The book is about the world that God created, the actual world of this planet. And he once described The Lord of the Rings as an exemplary legend. He elaborates on this point elsewhere, saying that one of his aims in writing The Lord of the Rings was the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in this real world, by the ancient device of exemplifying them in unfamiliar embodiments that may tend to bring them home. And it's important to do that because unless your understanding of truth and morals is integrated into day-to-day life, it remains abstract and irrelevant. Tolkien did not compartmentalize his faith. A repeated theme in the recollections of those who knew him is just how integral his faith was with his whole person. It manifested itself in a natural manner and was not put forward awkwardly or ostentatiously. His friend Robert Havard noted that his convictions were apparent but never paraded. Clyde Kilby, who assisted him with his work in the Silmarillion, said he could not recall, Clyde Kilby said, he could recall not a single visit I made to Tolkien's home in which the conversation did not at some point fall easily into a discussion of religion, or rather Christianity. He told me that he had many times been given a story as an answer to prayer. Kilby added to this that he'd been struck by the naturalness of Tolkien's faith. He would just fling out these things. Talking on the phone with a priest friend, I heard him say at the end of a conversation, well, may the Lord bless you, in the most sincere, feeling tone. Tolkien admitted that at times he did not live out his faith as he felt he ought to, but it was never just one activity out of many in his very busy life. And to understand this is to grasp a key insight into Tolkien's personality and his creative process. He once remarked that he found it impossible to disentangle faith and art. And in his important essay on fairy stories, he declared the writing of fantasy, and by extension, all literary creation, is a natural human activity, a human right. And this conviction was based on his belief that human beings had been made in the image and likeness of God. And since God is creative, we would be less than human if we were not to express that side of our nature. As Tolkien put it, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. As Kilby commented, Tolkien believed that creativity itself is a gift of God. Art will necessarily reflect something of the artist's most deeply held beliefs, whatever they may be, at least at some level, however subtle or implicit. For Tolkien, faith was not merely a set of opinions, but something integral to his real character and to his own self-understanding as an author. So it follows that if we are to understand and appreciate Tolkien's writings to the fullest degree, we need to come to an understanding of what he himself identified as central to his identity, his faith, which could not be disentangled from his art. Now let's move from the bigger picture to specific details and take a look at the way that Tolkien's creative imagination worked, how he used some of the source material that he absorbed. And I'll talk just about his reading now, and specifically his modern reading, because I think that's particularly relevant. Tolkien is often thought of as basically a medievalist, interested only in the past, but that wasn't the case. For instance, he kept up with the news, reading 3 newspapers, and he read widely in contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama. And in my investigation of his modern reading, one thing that has struck me is the sheer range and diversity of that reading. He enjoyed science fiction and fantasy, and he kept up to date with it. For instance, he read T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone soon after its publication. He enjoyed historical fiction, especially the works of Mary Renaud. And his grandson Michael recollected that he read detective fiction for relaxation, and he went out of his way to praise Agatha Christie. The leaf mold of his creative imagination was supplied with material by numerous authors, some of them now forgotten, such as J.H. Shorthouse or S.R. Crockett, some who are little known today, such as Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison, and others who are still well known, including W.H. Auden, Lewis Carroll, Kenneth Grahame, James Joyce, Edith Nesbit, Beatrix Potter, Dorothy L. Sayers, H.G. Wells, and P.G. Wodehouse. Now, certainly, he didn't like everything he read, as when he remarked of William Golding's The Lord of the Flies as being dreary stuff. In 1966, he commented, "The present mainstream of contemporary literature is so boring, isn't it? I'm offering a pleasant change of diet." But it was because he had continued to read widely that he was able to assess the literary scene and find it wanting. We see this illustrated in his famous wager, so-called, with C.S. Lewis. As Lewis remembered it, he remarked to Tolkien that there is too little of what we really like in stories, and so we shall have to write some ourselves. The two of them agreed that Lewis would write a space travel story, which became Out of the Silent Planet, and Tolkien took on a time travel story, which became the unfinished The Lost Road. The point here is that in order for Tolkien to agree that there is too little of what we really like in current science fiction, he had to be familiar with what was currently on offer, and this lack spurred him to fill the gap. And on various occasions, he openly acknowledged the ways in which modern fiction shaped his creative imagination. For instance, he recalled that George MacDonald and Andrew Lang composed the books which most affected the background of my imagination since childhood, and he specifically named MacDonald as an influence on his goblins and orcs. He acknowledged the aspects of The Lord of the Rings owed a debt to William Morris, and he observed that his use of the word crack in The Crack of Doom was, as he put it, ultimately derived from Algernon Blackwood, who used it in this way in one of his books. This list is extensive and varied. But this gathering will, of course, be particularly interested in Tolkien's reading of G.K. Chesterton. Tolkien read widely in Chesterton's work from a fairly early age. He read Heretics and Orthodoxy as a boy at King Edward's School, for instance. In later life, he had a great liking and appreciation for The Everlasting Man. Tolkien said that he felt his arguments to be absolutely valid. He enjoyed Chesterton's fiction, but not in the ways we might predict. He didn't like the detective stories of Father Brown. And I would probably say this is because they're more psychological in nature, and he seemed to enjoy the more puzzle-oriented mystery, as with Agatha Christie. But he certainly delighted in Chesterton's comic poetry. He knew by heart a number of poems, such as the Song of Quoodle, the Song Against Grocers, and the Rolling English Road. He also admired Tolkien's poem Lepanto and enjoyed reciting it. But it's not all that surprising that Tolkien would enjoy Chesterton's work. What is surprising, perhaps, is that Tolkien, as a devout Catholic, also read many authors who held views very different from his own, and he engaged with their work seriously, appreciating literary merit where he found it, without compromising his own deeply held beliefs. He enjoyed Rider Haggard's adventure tales, such as She and King Solomon's Mines, despite the author's ventures into pantheism and spiritualism. And he admired the science fiction of the dedicated atheist H.G. Wells. Wells is mostly remembered today for stories like The War of the Worlds, but in his time, he was a Richard Dawkins kind of figure. His massive book, Outline of History, which was published in 1920, presented a materialist, secular view of history that rejected the divinity of Christ. Nevertheless, Tolkien held Wells's science fiction in high regard, calling him one of the forgotten old masters of science fiction. Another significant figure in this regard is E.R. Edison, who's known today, if at all, for the worm Ouroboros, which is a tale of heroic adventure on the planet Mercury. Tolkien praised Edison as a great writer. And this praise is particularly interesting in view of his equally strong opposition to what he called Edison's peculiarly bad views. He wrote, "I thought that corrupted by an evil and indeed silly philosophy, he was coming to admire more and more arrogance and cruelty. Incidentally, I thought his nomenclature slipshod and often inept. In spite of all which, I still think of him as the greatest and most convincing writer of invented worlds that I have read." Edison's philosophy is consciously pagan, pantheistic, and dualistic. He equated pure goodness with stagnation and boredom, and declared that his literary heaven had to contain an element of evil because it is a heaven of action. And all of this ran contrary to Tolkien's Catholic faith, which maintains that God and creation are distinct and that God's perfect goodness has no ontologically equivalent opposite. Yet even so, Tolkien said he read Edison's works with great enjoyment for their sheer literary merit. There are many more examples, but even from this small sampling, we can see that Tolkien engaged eagerly and extensively with a very wide range of viewpoints in his reading of modern literature. And he was willing to draw on the literary works of these diverse authors as inspiration for his own writings. Let's consider the hobbits, the small, humble, but tough people who play such an important role in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. We can trace at least 3 distinct strands in their origins. One strand is a book called The Marvelous Land of Snurgs by E.A. Wick Smith. Tolkien describes this book as an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And we can see that the childlike Snurgs have a great deal in common with hobbits as Tolkien would come to depict them a few years later. And they share many of the habits of hobbits, such as a liking for feasts and the ability to shoot well with bow and arrow. A second strand is Beatrix Potter's rabbits. Tolkien himself once admitted that in the creation of the name Hobbit, he said, "Its faint suggestion of rabbit appealed to me." Tolkien knew Potter's work well, and he held it in high esteem. C.S. Lewis once remarked that he and Tolkien have often played with the idea of a pilgrimage to see her at her home in the Lake District, and pictured what fun it would be to shoulder aside the mobs of people who want to show you all the Wordsworth places with a brief rejoinder, "We are looking for Miss Potter." Peter Rabbit, his cousin Benjamin, and his uncle Mr. Benjamin Bunny may well have contributed to the overall concept of hobbits, which have a distinctly rabbity quality. Like hobbits, Potter's rabbits are human-like, but not human. They're quick and quiet of foot, easily overlooked by large persons. They're garden-loving and hole-dwelling. And indeed, the rabbits live in very pleasant holes, much like hobbit holes, as we can see from Potter's illustrations. In Peter Rabbit, the bunnies and their mother live in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree, which is later lauded as the neatest, sandiest hole of all. A third and quite different strand is the novel Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. This novel, published in 1922, is a satire on American middle-class culture. Tolkien said that he had read all of the work of Sinclair Lewis, and he explained to an interviewer that the word hobbit might have been associated with Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. He goes on to say, Babbitt has the same bourgeois smugness that hobbits do. His world is the same limited place. Now, this is a sizable admission. The character of George F. Babbitt certainly has something in common with Bilbo at the start of The Hobbit, as a well-fed member of the bourgeoisie with a hidden romantic streak. However, in Babbitt's case, his discontent with small-town social life leads him to have an extramarital affair. Although he eventually returns to his wife, he's left feeling defeated and disappointed. Bilbo's character development in The Hobbit shows, like Babbitt, a reaction against smugness that allows him to embrace his tookish romantic side and go off on adventures. Unlike Babbitt, however, Bilbo's motivation for leaving home is morally sound, and he returns happily enough to his roots. We should note that none of these three sources are explicitly Christian, yet Tolkien drew on these various materials, taken freely and with appreciation from authors who may or may not have agreed with any of his religious views, and he used it to help develop characters who would provide some of the most deeply Christian images in Middle-earth. In The Hobbit, Bilbo, who is the burglar of the party, absconds with the Arkenstone, the one gem beyond price in the dragon's hoard, and freely hands it over to Bard the bowman in order that it can be used in negotiations and thus avoid tragic violence between the people of Lake Town and the elves on the one side and the dwarves on the other. Bilbo allows the Arkenstone to be counted as his share of the dragon's treasure, and so he willingly sacrifices both his wealth and his status with the dwarves for the good of others. Bilbo's freedom from avarice allows him to become a Christ figure. In the end, we see that his action brings about reconciliation and restoration. Tolkien skillfully draws our attention, if we have ears to hear, to the Christian connections. The key chapter for this aspect of the story is called A Thief in the Night, alluding to our Lord's description of himself in Matthew chapter 24. And later, the dying Thorin is reconciled to Bilbo, calling him good thief. Turning to the Lord of the Rings, we find once again that the hobbits are of central importance, both in terms of the story and of its spiritual significance. Frodo and Sam in particular are vivid Christ figures in their arduous trek across Mordor to destroy the ring in the crack of doom. But all of the hobbits embody a deeply Christian image. In their childlike stature, we see a profound humility, and we're reminded that Jesus said, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." So we can see that Tolkien is able to draw from a remarkably diverse set of sources, snurgs, rabbits, Babbitt, none of which were particularly Christian, to aid in the creation of stories and characters that are profoundly rooted in his Christian faith. What have we learned from this as we see how Tolkien made use of these materials in his creative process? Well, one thing he shows us is the value of reading widely, finding what is good, true, and beautiful, not just in works written by those who share our beliefs, but by authors whose philosophical and religious views are contrary to our own. Tolkien did not feel obliged to agree with everyone whose books he read. Far from it. He even disagreed with people who were fellow Catholics. But this didn't stop him from reading their work and taking it seriously. He also shows us the importance of reading with a generous spirit. Tolkien certainly could be curmudgeonly if he took against an author or a book, but his reading as a whole shows his willingness to allow himself to be challenged, his willingness to enter into new and different points of view. And he shows us that this wide-ranging, charitable exploration of modern culture can and should result in a creative, transformative engagement with it. Tolkien did not ignore the problems of the modern world: war, doubt, suffering, ecological destruction, and totalitarianism. Rather, he made a profound response to it in his stories of Middle-earth. And he was able to do that as a Catholic, as a man of devout faith, because he was deeply grounded in his faith. He was a man of prayer. He was a man of the sacraments. He was a man who read the scriptures. He's so deeply rooted in his faith that he has a firm foundation to do this wide-ranging exploration. So, what can we sum up for our lesson from Tolkien and his creative imagination? We should not try to copy him in his works. We don't need a rehash of The Lord of the Rings. Indeed, it's such a vast and deeply layered book that it would be impossible to imitate. But we do need to emulate him. Emulating him means learning to engage with contemporary culture so that we can speak to our own time in fresh and powerful ways. And emulating him also means learning to be deeply grounded in our faith so that it becomes, for ourselves, as it was for Tolkien, the foundation of everything that he wrote and that we do and that we write as well. Thank you.